So I just got back from a trip to Brazil, and I gotta say that I really learned a lot. And not just about Brazilian culture, but about life in general. In short, I got some really great insight into what life is like on the other side of the world. So I thought it'd be really cool to come and share this information with you guys. So I conferred with some Brazilian friends of mine, and we collectively came up with 16 differences between Brazil and the US, including cultural differences, that really stick out between the two cultures. But before we get into this video, I just want to remind you all that these are all generalities. They do not represent an entire population of any country, but rather they come from my own experiences and from the opinions of other Brazilians that I've spoken with. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay guys, the first thing we gotta say right off the bat is that Brazilians are so nice, like super nice. Over the last 2 years, I got the incredible opportunity to stay with two different Brazilian families from two completely different sides of the country. But within 10 minutes of meeting these families for the very first time at the airport, I would find myself constantly being offered things, all the time. And not just food or drinks, but incredibly generous hospitality. And this shouldn't really come as a big surprise, since Brazil houses some of the largest populations of foreign ethnic groups in the world. For example, the largest population of Japanese people outside of Japan is in Brazil. This is also shown in the way that they greet each other. A lot of Brazilians that I met are not averse to hugging on the very first encounter. But in the US, that may be a little bit too forward if you're not comfortable with the person at first. But through my eyes at least, they really seem to see everyone as a friend, which I think is just so incredibly fantastic and forward thinking. The next one is Brazilians are never on time. Or rather, maybe I should say that life moves slower. If you tell a friend in Brazil that you want to meet them at 7 p.m., then they'll show up at 7:20 or 7:30 and no harm done. But in the US, 7 p.m. usually means 7 p.m., not 7:05, not 6:55, but 7. But there it's much more loose on the actual time, and they tend to focus more on the time they have together instead, which again is so incredibly sweet. The next one is that they don't tip in Brazil. They don't tip drivers, concierges, valets, waiters or waitresses, or anyone else. There just isn't a tipping culture, which it is completely different in the US because some jobs like waiters and waitresses in some states don't actually make a livable wage. So instead they depend on customers tipping them so that they can actually go home and eat tonight. And since they depend on this so much, tipping is really kind of required. And if you're that guy that just doesn't tip, then you're automatically in. But in Brazil you get along just fine. Alright, now we gotta talk about personal space. In the US, we have this like imaginary bubble around us that we don't want people to invade. We call it our personal space, and in general, if we don't know you that well, don't come into our personal space. But in Brazil, it's just space. Because whenever I would be conversing with someone, they would always get like really up in my face, it would seem. But really they're just trying to be friendly, and this is a way for them to tell you inadvertently that they're focusing on you, nothing but you, and the conversation that you're both having. So it's really interesting to see these two very different, yet both very viable perspectives. The next one is the eating culture. And I'm specifically talking about the time that it takes for the two different cultures to eat. In the US, we go to a restaurant to eat. We go there, we immediately order, we eat our food, and then we leave. But in Brazil, you may come in with a couple of friends, sit down at the table, wait for the waiter to come by, call over the waiter after maybe half an hour of talking with each other. Then you'll talk some more, get your food, talk some more, wait another hour until all of your food is done, talk some more, and before you know it, 4 hours has gone by. Eating, in my experience, was really more of a social event than anything else in Brazil. Another thing that I thought was absolutely hilarious in Brazil was how they called over the waiters. They would use words like bro, friend, buddy, and even champion to call the waiters over in Portuguese. Oi, campeão, a gente vai pedir. I can't get over that. Mostly because this would sound so incredibly condescending in English, but I don't exactly know why. Alright, the next one is something that I've not only noticed in Brazil, but also in some countries in Europe as well. And this is the idea that if you walk into any kind of social event, you have to say hello and goodbye to everyone individually at the party. Even if you don't even know their name, even if you've never even spoken or seen them before in your life. So just imagine if you're at a place with 200, 300 people and you really need to leave, but before you do that, you have to go and give beijos to 300 people. I asked several Brazilians why this is, and almost all of them told me that,
yeah, it's kind of annoying, but it's just the way that it is.
And for all you out there that are watching from outside the US, in the US, we would just give one collective goodbye to everyone and then leave. Or maybe we would just say thank you to the host of the party and then leave. But either way, it's really quick. And even though it does take more time, I really like the more personal, intimate nature of this cultural practice. It also gives you an excuse to go out there and be social, so that's one more thing. Alright, the next thing that we have to talk about is meals. And since the US is this giant melting pot with over 190 plus different nationalities living in it, we have a lot of variety in the food that we eat on a daily basis. But if you are in Brazil or you plan to travel to Brazil, there's a good chance that you'll be eating a lot of rice, beans, and meat. Lots and lots of glorious meats. Another small thing is that they only eat fried eggs in the afternoon and not for breakfast. And it was really funny because when I was staying in a Brazilian's apartment, I thought I would be nice and get up early and make breakfast for all of them because they were so incredibly nice to me and allowed me to stay in their apartment. So I made one of the only things that I knew how to make, eggs, and while I was making them in the kitchen at like 7 a.m., he came in with a cup of coffee and was like,
"What are you doing?"
Now, he wasn't really like that, but he was kind of shocked because he didn't know that we only eat eggs in the morning in the US. Another thing is that Brazilians never eat food with their fingers. But in the US, as long as you're in private company, everything can be eaten with your fingers. Everything. I've probably tasted soup with my fingers before. But in Brazil, they'll eat things like pizza and hamburgers with a fork and knife. And this is so weird in North America that there was even an article published in the news about the mayor of New York City being caught exposed eating pizza or a burger with a fork and knife. And in retrospect, I don't know why this is so weird. I guess it's because no one ever does it. But of course there's nothing actually wrong with that. But whatever, I digress. The next thing about Brazil that I absolutely love is that all tax is included in the prices. So if something says that it costs $2, it's $2. But in the US, you have to like pull out your calculator and do all these math equations and solve for X and Y and figure out just how much you're going to be taxed on all foods to see if you can really afford it or not, because the price is always misleading and comes before tax. The next thing is that Brazil is very, very green. Even in the largest cities in the country, in places like Rio and Sao Paulo, you cannot get away from the nature. Whereas in the US, if you're in a big metropolitan area, you often won't even find the slightest hint of any sort of woods or natural happenings. And even though a country like Brazil is growing very, very fast, it is far less industrialized and you'll see a lot of empty space in between cities and towns. But this again just gives you another opportunity to look at the absolutely beautiful nature that is ubiquitous in Brazil. Another thing that you'll see in Brazil that you won't really see in the US is specialized stores. And this idea has a lot of European influence as well. For example, if you want to get meat, then you go to the meat store, the place that only sells meat. Or if you want cheese or if you want bread, then you'll go to the respective stores for those. But in the US, we tend to just plump everything together and have people go to one place for everything that they need. But I feel like this really sacrifices the quality and the authenticity of the product that you're actually receiving. There's also a few key differences in small talk between the two cultures. In the US, we'll usually ask how someone is doing. If we're really boring, we may ask about the weather. And if we have absolutely nothing else to say, we may ask you about what you're doing today. But from what I've seen in Brazil, it's a lot more personal. They'll ask about your family. How are your mom and dad doing? Is everyone healthy? How are your pets doing? And even though this is small talk, they really seem to care. A lot more emphasis is put on the health and the well-being of those around you. But in the US, it just seems like this meaningless cultural ritual that we do for no reason just because we want to be polite. Another thing. Brazilians are really touchy when it comes to American standards. And this goes back to the whole personal space thing that we already talked about. If you're at a party, for instance, and you're in a group talking to both girls and boys, it's not unheard of for both boys and girls to touch you in a way when they feel really excited or as a form of exclamation, especially if they find something interesting or cool about what you're saying. But for a lot of Americans, this can really be misinterpreted as that person just likes them. And while that could be the case, it's most likely not the case. They're just being nice. The next thing is this whole idea about a no culture. From what I've heard, it's really rude to turn down something after someone offered you something in Brazil. Mostly because that person is seen as being really generous for offering anything to you in the first place. So if you reject it, you're kind of disregarding their whole generosity. As long as you have a good reason for turning down something in the US, it's usually okay. And it's not like it's this incredibly strict thing in Brazil either, but it's definitely taken a lot more heavily than it is in the US. Alright, there's one more thing, but I'm gonna turn it into two things because they're really quick, and just a couple of miscellaneous things that I've noticed after being in Brazil for several months. One thing is that most of the cars that I saw on Brazilian streets were manual, but in the US, the vast majority of cars that are driven are automatic, for sure. And if you drive a manual car, you're perceived to be part of this weird niche community that only makes up a very small amount of the population. But that minority seems to be in the majority in a place like Brazil. The second thing is that there are a lot of street animals around, especially dogs. And even though they look so cute and cuddly at first, you probably shouldn't pet them. There are so many videos on the internet about somebody trying to go pet a street dog and then consequently getting attacked. Lastly, I know I said I was done, but just hang in with me here. I've only been talking about differences in this video, but I want to talk really quick about one key similarity that we have with not only Brazilian people, but everybody else in the world. And that is that even though we have different perspectives, even though we grew up in a different environment, even though we speak different languages, we all have the same core needs and desires on the inside. We all want to be happy, we all want to be loved, and we all want to live a fulfilling life. But to sum it all up, we're all human. Until next time.